Martin Grayson had never been one to attract attention. He didn't own flashy cars or talk too loudly at gatherings, and he certainly didn't participate in neighborhood gossip. He had spent most of his life working with his hands, quiet, focused work, restoring old furniture, fixing what others would have tossed, and giving forgotten things new purpose. His business wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave him a sense of calm that office life never could. When his father suffered a mild stroke last spring, Martin left his small rental on the city's edge and relocated closer to the suburbs, where he could visit more often and make sure his father had everything he needed without being too intrusive. They were alike in that way. Private, quiet, fiercely independent men who didn't enjoy unnecessary fuss. The house Martin moved into was modest but well-built, tucked away near the end of a long, tree-lined street that split into a cul-de-sac. The air was cleaner than in the city, and the only sounds at night were the occasional barking of distant dogs or the low rustle of wind stirring the maples. It wasn't paradise, but it was peaceful, and that suited Martin just fine. The previous owner had left behind a few things, including a vintage mailbox mounted on a slightly rusted metal post. It had character, a curved top, flaking black paint, and a faint brass plaque that read Number 54 in an elegant, old-fashioned font. It stood a little crooked, leaning forward like a man with a bad back, but Martin liked it. He planned to eventually reinforce the base, but for now, it did the job. On his fourth day in the neighborhood, he was out front resealing a crack in the driveway when she introduced herself. He heard the click of deliberate heels before he saw her. She approached from the right, hands clasped tightly in front of her like she was inspecting a property she intended to sell. Her posture was ramrod straight, and she wore a muted floral dress that looked both expensive and severe under the sun. "You must be the new tenant," she said with a crisp, almost rehearsed smile. "Karen Billings. I live 2 houses down." Martin stood up slowly and wiped his hands on a rag, nodding politely. "That's right, Martin. Good to meet you." Her eyes had already shifted from his face to the front of the house, scanning with faint disapproval. "Yes, well, we do like to keep things tidy around here. Very cohesive. No wild paint jobs or eccentric landscaping, you know?" He wasn't sure how to respond to that, so he nodded again, non-committally. Her eyes finally landed on the mailbox. Her mouth twitched. "That's still there." Martin followed her gaze. "The mailbox? Yeah, it came with the place. Bit of a relic, but I kinda like it. Well, it's not exactly standard. The street was updated 2 years ago. Everyone's box was replaced then. Matching posts, uniform height, that sort of thing. It's not just aesthetics. It's about unity. Order." Martin tilted his head slightly. "Is that a written rule, or more of a suggestion?" She smiled wider, but it didn't reach her eyes. It strongly encouraged. With that, she gave a tight nod and walked off, not waiting for a response. Martin watched her go, feeling that odd mix of amusement and wariness. He had met people like her before. Polished, proud, thinly veiled authoritarianism wrapped in suburban politeness. He didn't have the energy for conflict, and he certainly wasn't interested in pleasing anyone who thought a crooked mailbox threatened neighborhood order. Over the next week, he settled in, made repairs to the porch railing, organized his workshop in the garage, started checking in on his father every other evening. The neighborhood seemed quiet, almost eerily so. People waved but didn't stop to talk. Kids weren't out on bikes. There were no barbecues or porch conversations. It was tidy, organized, silent. The kind of place where nothing happened on the surface, and maybe that was part of its appeal. Martin wasn't looking for community. He just needed somewhere to work, sleep, and be close enough to family without being suffocated by it. Then, on the 12th morning after moving in, he stepped out to grab the newspaper and stopped cold. The mailbox was gone. Not vandalized, not knocked over, gone. Clean break at the base of the post. The dirt was still soft, suggesting it had been done in the last few hours. His first thought was confusion. quickly followed by a ripple of anger. It wasn't valuable. It wasn't fancy. But it was his, and someone had decided they had the right to remove it without a word. He asked 2 neighbors about it, both of whom gave vaguely apologetic shrugs and said they hadn't noticed anything. One man, Greg, from across the street, mentioned seeing a white SUV parked near the house late the previous night, but he hadn't thought much of it. Martin thanked them both and walked back to the driveway, trying to keep his irritation in check. He installed a temporary box from the hardware store and bolted it into a short wooden post. It was crude, nothing decorative, but it worked. 2 days later, it was flattened. The post splintered, box twisted and bent like someone had driven over it slowly, deliberately. No tire tracks, but the grass was torn in a lazy arc, just off the edge of the curb. Martin crouched beside it, examining the damage, and felt a slow, familiar burn in his chest. Not rage, he wasn't built like that, but a kind of cold pressure, the quiet certainty that something was escalating. He didn't call the police. Not yet. He didn't have footage, no witnesses, nothing to go on except a suspicion, and suspicion was worthless without proof. But that evening, he began sketching a design. He drew out the base dimensions for a new post, solid steel core, hidden reinforcement, bolted through concrete. Externally, it would look like any other mailbox on the block, black, arched, standard number on the side. But this one wouldn't fall, not without taking something with it. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't make a scene. He just worked late in the garage for the next few nights, welding the inner frame, fitting the mailbox shell around it, pouring concrete into a custom base mold. By Friday, it was ready. He installed it early in the morning before the sun rose fully, tamped the soil down neatly around it, and stood back. It looked perfect. Just another box on another quiet street. But this one wasn't going anywhere. When Karen walked past later that day, she paused. Her eyes flicked to the mailbox, lingered for a moment, and then returned to his. She didn't say anything, just offered that same tight-lipped smile and kept walking. Martin watched her go, then turned and went back inside. He didn't know what would come next. But something told him the game wasn't over. Not yet. It started with the sound of tires skidding, barely audible through the double-pane windows and the morning hush, but sharp enough to pull Martin's attention away from his coffee. He stood in the kitchen, back to the window, half-focused on the quiet creak of the house settling and the soft buzz of a morning radio show playing from the neighbor's garage. When he stepped outside 5 minutes later, travel mug in hand and boots barely laced, he immediately knew something was off. The new mailbox, the one he'd spent a week designing, welding, and setting in concrete, stood crooked, not destroyed. Not flattened, just tilted, like a boxer who had taken a clean punch and hadn't quite recovered. The earth around the base was torn, fresh soil displaced in 2 clean arcs. As he got closer, he saw a smear of white paint along the steel reinforcement where the shell had buckled ever so slightly on impact. He crouched and examined the damage with methodical calm, his mind already putting together a rough reconstruction. A low-speed collision. Deliberate. Not enough to break the post, not this time, but enough to send a message. He didn't bother knocking on any doors that morning. He already knew what he wouldn't find: witnesses, admission, or concern. This wasn't something people liked to get involved in. Not when it was between that neighbor and someone they barely knew. Instead, he pulled out a notebook and logged the time, the condition of the mailbox, the paint color, eggshell white, and the direction of the tire marks, shallow but visible if you looked hard enough on the dewy grass. Later that day, Martin made his first formal visit to the police station. He didn't call ahead. He didn't arrive angry or impatient. He just walked in, signed the log, and waited 15 minutes until someone called his name. The officer, young, polite, and clearly on a routine shift, listened as Martin explained the history, laid out the facts, and handed over the photographs he'd printed that morning. The officer nodded, took notes, and eventually said that a report could be filed for vandalism. But unless there were witnesses or clear video footage, There wouldn't be much they could do right now. Still, he encouraged Martin to report any further incidents, especially if it escalated. Martin didn't expect miracles. He wasn't naive, but he wanted the paper trail started. He wanted the matter on record, logged, time-stamped, something that couldn't be waved away as hearsay later. Over the next few days, nothing happened. The mailbox stood strong. The white smear remained as a quiet badge of its endurance. Martin kept to himself, worked late in his garage, took care of his father's errands, and didn't speak to anyone unless spoken to. But the silence wasn't peace. It was the kind that hums behind your ears when you're waiting for something to snap. It snapped on a Tuesday afternoon. He was returning from the post office, 2 padded envelopes under one arm, when he turned the corner onto his street and saw a white SUV parked at the curb directly across from his driveway. Not just any SUV, Karen's. It was unmistakable. Polished, oversized, and parked like she'd just stepped out for a moment. But she wasn't anywhere in sight. The front of the SUV faced his property, and Martin's eyes instinctively dropped to the front bumper. There, against the chrome trim, was a fresh, uneven scrape, low and horizontal with a faint gray edge. It matched the position and height of his mailbox perfectly. As he pulled into his driveway, the SUV door opened. Karen stepped out, dressed as if she'd come from a luncheon. She didn't look surprised to see him, but her expression flickered just enough to betray something. Not guilt, calculation. "Oh," she said casually, "didn't realize you'd be back so early." Martin nodded at the bumper. "Trouble with the curb?" She looked down briefly, then back up. Her face remained neutral. "Not at all. Someone must have hit me at the grocery store. People these days have no respect." He didn't respond. She didn't wait for one. With a small, tight smile, she turned and walked off toward her house, keys swinging from one finger like a pendulum. Martin watched her go, his jaw tight, eyes narrowing at the confident sway in her step. He spent that evening going over his earlier notes, updating the police report, and adding a new page for this incident. He submitted it online, attaching fresh photos of the mailbox and a long lens shot of Karen's bumper taken from the sidewalk. No trespassing involved, just a careful angle and good timing. It wasn't evidence of guilt, but it was one more line on the record. 2 days later, he found a letter folded and shoved into the crack of his front door. No envelope, no signature, just one sheet of printer paper, typed in bold, blocky font. "We take care of our own. Outsiders don't last." There were no flourishes, no personal language, just those words, center-aligned, stark, and final. Martin held the letter in his hand for a full minute before folding it again and sliding it into a new manila folder. He didn't panic. He didn't call anyone. He documented, as he always did, photographed the door, measured the height of the insert point, checked for smudges or prints, though he found none. He printed the photos, updated the report again, and logged it with a new notation. Implied threat received. No direct attribution. Recommend a police review escalation protocol. He didn't believe the police would do much beyond noting the report, but he knew that the number of entries was starting to matter, that eventually someone would be forced to take notice, not by drama, not by confrontation, but by weight, the weight of documentation, consistency, and calm persistence. That night, as he stood outside staring at the mailbox, he felt something shift. Not fear, not anger, something else. A quiet conviction. This wasn't about the mailbox anymore. It hadn't been for a while. It was about someone drawing a line and another person erasing it just to prove they could. And that meant Martin had no intention of stepping back. Not now. Not ever. Martin had never expected the issue to resolve itself, but he also hadn't anticipated just how quickly the mood around him would begin to curdle. After the typed threat slipped through his door, the tone of the neighborhood shifted in small but deliberate ways. More a change in air pressure than a storm, but perceptible if you paid attention. The elderly man who once nodded politely when walking his dog now avoided eye contact. The couple across the street stopped parking on their usual side and began backing their car into the garage as soon as they returned home, blinds snapping shut a few minutes later. One morning, Martin came outside to find a bundle of circulars that should have been delivered to his mailbox stuffed into his fence latch, rubber banded like an afterthought. He couldn't prove anything, each thing minor on its own, but collectively it painted a picture of soft exile, the kind that doesn't make noise but squeezes from all sides like a vice. He wasn't interested in confrontation. He wasn't a provocateur. But silence, he understood, was not the same as peace, and what was happening here wasn't passive, it was targeted. So he adapted, carefully. He updated the mailbox shell. Nothing visibly different, just a slight reinforcement of the outer skin and a reattachment of the damaged front flap with a stronger internal hinge. The next step wasn't surveillance. Martin still didn't like the idea of cameras and didn't trust the feeling of being watched in his own home. Instead, he installed a motion-sensitive floodlight above the garage and pointed it toward the street-facing front yard. It was bright enough to bleach the sidewalk and flash into passing windshields, but subtle enough to pass for standard home security. He paired it with a driveway sensor buried discreetly in the gravel that would buzz a soft chime inside whenever someone or something crossed into the yard perimeter. Not invasive, not illegal, just careful. 3 nights later, the chime went off at 1:38 a.m. Martin was awake, though not expecting it. He'd fallen asleep in the living room, dozing with a repair manual spread across his chest, and the faint buzz stirred him just enough to register the noise before he registered the fear. He didn't leap up. Instead, he waited. One heartbeat, then another, until the second chime sounded. Then he moved, slowly, quietly. Lights off, steps soft. He approached the window without touching the curtain and peered through a sliver in the fabric. There was a figure. Not fully visible, but there, human height, crouched at the edge of the curb, and then, just as quickly, gone. He heard no car, no door, no engine. Just the distant rustle of wind and the hollow space where a noise should have been. He waited 10 minutes before going outside. When he did, the mailbox stood untouched, though something had been disturbed near its base. The soil was unsettled again, but this time deeper, like someone had attempted to dig or loosen the post and changed their mind. He didn't approach it. Instead, he walked the perimeter with a flashlight, inspecting the lawn, the fence line, the hedge bordering the side yard. No footprints, no tools, but a plastic zip tie lay broken near the path. New, black, thin, not something he used. He took another set of photos, added them to the folder, updated his log. But this time, he didn't just submit an online update to the previous report. He returned to the police station in person, with a full binder and a printed summary of each incident by date and detail. The woman behind the desk didn't rush him. She took the papers, flipped through them, and told him to wait a moment while she spoke with an officer. 20 minutes later, he found himself sitting across from a plain-spoken officer named Morales, who asked direct questions and listened without distraction. Martin explained everything, without embellishment, without emotional flourishes, and finished with the last incident, the figure near the curb, the disturbed soil, the broken zip tie. Morales didn't make promises. He didn't offer instant justice, but he did take the binder and say that a case file would be formally opened and flagged for ongoing monitoring. He advised Martin to remain cautious and to notify the department of any future encounters. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, that if Martin could afford to install at least one camera, even temporarily, it might help establish a clearer timeline if things escalated. Martin considered it, seriously this time. But before he could act on that advice, things took another turn. 3 days later, Martin received an envelope not from the police or city, but from the local development council. It arrived by mail, crisp and formal, with his name printed correctly and no return address beyond the standard department header. Inside was a notice, a complaint, technically, citing an alleged structural deviation from standard residential infrastructure related to his mailbox. The letter claimed it did not comply with community design standards and referenced a line about uniform presentation requirements for public-facing fixtures. No fine was issued yet, but the implication was clear. Failure to address the nonconformity could result in corrective action. He stared at the letter for a long time. He knew what this was. It was bureaucratic erosion. The kind of slow administrative warfare people like Karen knew how to wage, weaponizing procedures and committees to harass under the guise of policy. He checked the date of the complaint. Filed 2 days after his last police report. Coincidence? Maybe, but unlikely. He didn't waste time ranting. Instead, he collected his documentation again. Photos, repair receipts, product specifications from the box's manufacturer, even a letter from the original installer, and drafted a formal reply. He included references to local code and attached his own measurements proving the mailbox complied with all official regulations. He mailed it certified, then made a second copy and dropped it off at the council's office in person. On the way back home, he passed Karen in her driveway. She was watering her potted plants, perfectly spaced terracotta rows, manicured like a showroom. She didn't look at him until he was nearly even with her. Then she smiled. "Looks like you're settling in nicely," she said, too sweet, voice honeyed and hard-edged beneath the surface. Martin kept his tone even. "Not everyone seems thrilled." Her smile widened, brittle at the edges. "Well, some of us like to maintain standards. Things get messy otherwise." He nodded once and walked on, her stare prickling between his shoulder blades. That night he checked the sensor logs again. Nothing. The motion light hadn't triggered either. He tried to sleep, but rest didn't come easily anymore. Not from fear, but from vigilance. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The next day, as he drove his father to a medical appointment, they stopped briefly at a gas station. When Martin returned to the car, he noticed something odd. His windshield was streaked with something sticky, subtle, but there. A thin smear across the passenger side, almost invisible until the sun hit it at just the right angle. He dipped a napkin in water and wiped a patch clean. The liquid was tacky, sugary. Soda? Maybe, or juice, or something else. It didn't damage the paint. It didn't leave a permanent mark. But it had been deliberate. It was the kind of action meant to go unnoticed by most. But Martin wasn't most people anymore. When they returned home, he made another entry in the log, not because it was evidence, but because it was another drop in a growing bucket. And buckets, when filled, always tipped. The escalation wasn't loud. It didn't arrive in shouting matches or broken windows. It came through clipped smiles, vague letters, and nighttime movements barely visible in the dark. And yet, it was no less real, no less dangerous. Martin knew he had passed a threshold. There would be no return to neutral. Not with Karen. Not with the silent neighbors. Not with the system slowly shifting underfoot. He didn't know yet what the next move would be, but he had already made his. He would stand. Martin didn't want to install a camera. For weeks, he had resisted the idea. Not because he was naive or careless, but because something in him recoiled at the idea of being watched, even if he was the one doing the watching. But resistance only holds out so long when the pressure becomes constant. After the complaint letter from the council, after the late-night disturbances, and after the windshield incident, the balance finally tipped. He purchased a small, motion-activated camera. No Wi-Fi, no app, just a simple unit with a rotating lens and an internal SD card that could record for days at a time. He mounted it behind the edge of a windowsill, tucked between a flower pot and a porch beam, pointed towards the front yard. It was a compromise. Discreet, private, passive, but necessary. For nearly a week, nothing happened. The mailbox remained intact. The sensor light never flicked on. The neighborhood returned to its eerie semblance of normalcy. Silent lawns, quiet driveways, eyes that avoided his. But it wasn't over. Martin knew that calm had become an illusion in this place, a thin layer painted over something festering just beneath. He didn't relax. He waited. The break came on a rainy Thursday evening. The camera's indicator light blinked rapidly when he checked it. New motion recorded. He downloaded the file and watched it in silence. The timestamp read 2:11 a.m. The video began with a still frame of the driveway, wet from the drizzle, dimly lit by the motion light. Then movement. A car, white SUV, no visible plates, crept slowly into the frame and came to a gentle stop just beyond the curb. The driver didn't exit. Instead, the passenger door opened and a figure stepped out, hooded, gloved, face obscured. They approached the mailbox with a purposeful gait, pulled something from their jacket, metallic, shaped like pliers or a cutter, and leaned in. Martin paused the video there, zooming in on the frame. The camera's resolution wasn't great, but it was clear enough to make out intent. This wasn't vandalism born of impulse. It was methodical, quiet, prepared. But then something unexpected happened. The person suddenly jerked back, stumbling slightly, dropping the tool. For a second, the camera caught a glint, perhaps the edge of the steel post beneath the decorative shell, or the thin film of rain catching light. Either way, the figure hesitated, bent down to retrieve the object, and fled back into the SUV. The car rolled backward, slowly, as if trying to avoid triggering attention, and then vanished into the night. Martin didn't feel vindicated. He felt something colder. It confirmed everything he had suspected, that this wasn't just a neighborly dispute that got out of hand. It was a campaign, a quiet, persistent effort to push him out or wear him down. But the footage was the first concrete piece of evidence he had. Something with shape. Something he could bring in. So, the next day, he returned to the police station and met with Officer Morales again. He handed over the footage, the log update, and the incident summary he'd prepared. Morales took his time, watching the clip twice, taking notes in his pad. When it was over, he looked at Martin with something approximating tired understanding. Not disbelief, but a quiet acknowledgement of the weight of being right in a situation where the truth alone wasn't enough. "This isn't nothing," Morales said. "And now that we've got a face, well, a figure, we can open a formal investigation. I'll add this to the case file. Just be aware, it may not move fast, especially if we can't get a plate." Martin nodded. He understood. But it was a start. That afternoon, a second letter arrived. Not from the police or the council this time, but from a private legal service. It was a formal cease and desist, citing Martin for intentional endangerment of public safety infrastructure. The language was dense, overblown, full of legal posturing and vague threats. At its core, the letter claimed his mailbox constituted a deliberate hazard that had already caused unreported vehicular damage and that further action could lead to civil litigation. Martin read it once, then again, then a third time, slower. It wasn't from the city. It wasn't from the post office. It wasn't even from the neighborhood administration. It was from a private law firm in the next town over. And while the letter was signed, the signature was illegible, and the firm's address led to a general office building without listed attorneys on their website. He didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, he made copies, filed them, then took a slow walk around the block. He noticed, for the first time, that 3 of the mailboxes along his street had recently been replaced. Brand new posts, fresh black paint, perfectly measured height. He knew those homes hadn't had upgrades when he moved in, and he knew who had made the changes. Whether it was Karen directly or her influence bleeding through the neighborhood, It didn't matter. The effect was real. People were adjusting around her orbit, aligning not because they believed her, but because it was safer than opposing her. He passed Karen's house. She was on the porch again, speaking to someone, a man in a crisp jacket who didn't belong to the neighborhood. Martin didn't slow down, but he caught the last few words. Just keep the pressure up. He'll break eventually. She didn't lower her voice. She didn't care if he heard. Martin didn't respond. He kept walking. That night he received a voicemail from someone at the legal firm. A clipped voice advised him to take the matter seriously and warned that liability would not be on our client if the matter escalated. The message ended without details, no return number offered. It didn't shake him, but it did confirm something he'd begun to suspect. This wasn't about a mailbox, not really. This was about dominance, territory, control. He had defied the expected path. He hadn't submitted, hadn't moved, hadn't bowed, and for that he was now marked as a disruption. And in neighborhoods like this, disruptions were corrected, either by policy or pressure. But Martin wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not after all this. He took the camera footage, the letter, the voicemail, and the photos, and he compiled a single dossier. A clean, focused case. And then, without drama, he contacted a local civil attorney who specialized in nuisance law and property disputes. He sent over the file and asked for a meeting. For the first time, Martin shifted from defense to position. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't about proving himself. It was about drawing a line no one could cross without consequence. Because if they were going to keep pushing, they needed to understand exactly what they were pushing against. The meeting with the attorney wasn't dramatic. There were no cinematic revelations, no gasps, no urgent faxes sent mid-conversation. Martin arrived early, dressed plainly, carrying a single folder packed with weeks of documentation. He sat in a minimalist office that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old books, while a clock ticked quietly behind him. When the attorney, Monica Ellis, entered, she didn't offer small talk. She glanced through the folder for a few minutes in silence, pausing occasionally to read aloud segments from the complaint letters and legal threats. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair, hands clasped. "This isn't random," she said plainly. "It's pressure. Classic civilian harassment masked under procedural legitimacy. They're not attacking your mailbox. They're attacking your right to stand your ground." Martin didn't nod or frown. He simply waited. She continued. "What they've sent you, these complaints, the threat of litigation, the veiled warnings, they're smoke. They want you nervous, quiet, gone. But legally, you're in the clear. Every regulation you've cited is correct. They have no grounds. If this escalates into an actual suit, I'll represent you. But for now, you're not to respond to anything else that doesn't come certified or with legal filing numbers. Do not react. Let them show their hand." Martin thanked her, left a retainer deposit, and walked out with a strange calm pulsing in his chest. It wasn't relief. It wasn't confidence. It was something steadier, an internal shift from waiting to watching, from defending to positioning. If they were going to move again, they'd have to do it in the open, and Martin would be ready. But escalation never arrives when expected. The next incident happened not at night, not in secret, but at 3:40 in the afternoon, in full daylight. Martin had stepped out to retrieve a delivery, replacement hinges for a cabinet repair, when he noticed movement across the street. Karen was standing in the middle of her lawn, shouting. At first, he thought she was talking to someone on the phone, but then she pointed directly at him and yelled louder. "There he is! That's him! That's the one I told you about!" A second later, a uniformed man stepped out from the side of her house. Not a police officer, security contractor, dark slacks, tucked polo, utility belt with a holstered taser and radio. He approached slowly but deliberately, crossing the street without breaking eye contact. Martin didn't flinch. He stood where he was, package still in hand, as the guard stopped 6 feet away. "I'm going to have to ask you to return inside, sir." Martin raised an eyebrow. "Why?" The guard kept his voice level, professional but cold. "I've been instructed to inform you that a complaint has been made about suspicious behavior. For everyone's safety, we're advising no contact between you and the complainant until the situation is reviewed." Martin glanced past the guard to Karen, who was now smiling. "This isn't a gated community," Martin said. "You're a private security agent on a public sidewalk telling me to go into my house for standing on my own driveway." "That's correct," the man replied. Martin stepped back slowly, not because he was afraid, but because there was nothing to gain from resisting. Not here, not with a third party watching, writing reports that would later be submitted without context. Inside, he made another log entry, noted the name tag he'd seen on the guard's uniform, checked the security agency's website, and filed a brief complaint. Then he made a second call, to Monica Ellis. "This is coordinated," he told her. "She's now using private enforcement to create confrontation she can escalate. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move. But that interaction, it's going to be written up like a warning, a safety threat. And next time, who knows?" Monica was silent for a moment. "I'm sending a request to that agency for the incident report. If they can't produce one, or if there's embellishment, we file for harassment and misuse of force under false pretense. Meanwhile, keep documenting. If she wants to frame you as the problem, she's going to need more than just theatrics." 2 days later, it rained again. Not heavy, but steady enough to keep most people indoors. Martin spent the afternoon working in the garage, rebuilding a warped dresser frame, the rhythmic clamp and glue process soothing him into a rare state of mental quiet. Then, at 5:17 p.m., he heard it. A sharp bang, then a long, scraping crunch, metal against metal. He stepped outside. The mailbox was still standing, but 20 feet down the curb, his pickup had been sideswiped. The driver's side was gashed in a diagonal line, the side mirror crushed inward. The other car was already accelerating away. White SUV, no plates again. He didn't shout, didn't chase, just stared as it disappeared around the bend. He knew what would happen next. He called the police. When they arrived, he handed over the incident log, the footage from his motion cam, and descriptions of the vehicle. He didn't accuse. He described. The officer, someone new, someone who seemed younger and less familiar with the broader context, took notes with a practiced detachment. Promised a review, promised a follow-up. But Martin knew that footage wouldn't reveal anything new. Not the driver. Not a plate. Just another act designed to humiliate, to push him toward retaliation. Later that night, as he sat at his dining table with the damage report laid out beside a cup of coffee going cold, he received a text. From a number he didn't recognize. One sentence, no punctuation. "You're not welcome. You were never welcome. Fix that, or we will." He didn't forward it to the police. Not yet. He forwarded it to Monica. "This," she said when she called him 20 minutes later, "is what we've been waiting for. Save it. I'll pull metadata. Let's see who's stupid enough to think threats that can't be traced." That same week, a neighbor approached him in secret. Her name was Julia. Mid-50s, kept mostly to herself, always walking a small terrier past his yard without a word. She stopped him one morning as he was returning from the store. Eyes wide, voice low. "I just wanted to say, I saw what happened to your truck. That was her. Don't let her win." Martin didn't ask how she knew. He just nodded, and Julia, after a pause, whispered one last thing. She did this before. Not like this, but similar. With a guy who built a pergola without approval. He moved out 6 weeks later. She said he didn't understand the neighborhood. But I remember the bruises on his car. You're the first one to last this long." Martin thanked her. That night, he received the security agency's internal report via Monica. It described the driveway incident in bland language, but it included one line that stuck out like rot in drywall. The subject appeared confrontational. Complainant stated fear for her safety. It was a lie, a quiet one, but now a recorded one. Martin stared at it long after the page blurred. Not because he was surprised, but because now he understood. This wasn't just a campaign of intimidation. This was a scaffold of false records being built brick by brick, paper by paper, until one day someone in authority would look at the file and believe it without question, unless he stopped it. And he would. Martin had spent most of his life believing that if you remained calm, stayed within the boundaries of law and logic, and didn't provoke, the world would generally leave you alone. That belief had been eroding for weeks, but it finally cracked the morning he received a formal letter from the Department of Public Infrastructure stating that ongoing reports regarding safety concerns related to his residence and fixtures were being referred for administrative review. The wording was neutral, bureaucratic, carefully sterile, but the implication was unmistakable. Someone had found a way to reach beyond the neighborhood, to move this battle into the hands of officials who didn't know Martin, didn't care about context, and wouldn't be patient enough to separate fact from carefully planted fiction. He reread the letter 3 times. Each sentence felt like a veiled threat. What disturbed him most was the line near the end. "Pending outcomes. This office reserves the right to escalate concerns to municipal enforcement bodies for resolution." It was the first time the conflict had breached into actual institutional power. The slow erosion had become open leverage. Martin didn't panic, but he didn't sit still either. He printed out every complaint, every letter, every report, and copied them onto a USB drive along with the footage from his motion camera, the photos of his truck, the text messages, the recordings, and every log entry with timestamps. Then he compiled a single printed dossier and drove it downtown to the district attorney's community liaison office. He didn't ask for special treatment. He didn't raise his voice. He simply handed over the folder and said, "I need this on record before someone decides I'm the problem." The clerk behind the counter didn't ask questions. She took the file and gave him a stamped receipt. It wasn't a solution, but it was protection. Another layer of truth made real in an office that couldn't pretend it didn't exist. The next night, Martin sat alone in his living room with the lights off, watching the shadows shift outside his window. The camera hadn't picked up anything new in days, but he no longer trusted silence. It had become the most dangerous sound of all. At 2:12 a.m., the driveway chime went off. He didn't move. He waited. At 2:13, it went off again. This time, he stood, walked to the kitchen, and pressed the switch that triggered the floodlight. The yard exploded in harsh white illumination, shadows fleeing from every corner. For a moment, there was nothing. Then, movement. A figure darted from the far side of the hedge and bolted toward the sidewalk. Martin reached the door in time to see the white SUV slam into gear and peel away, taillights vanishing into the curve. He didn't chase. Instead, he walked to the mailbox and found something taped to the back, clear tape over a printed photo. It was a still from one of his own security clips, zoomed in on him standing outside in the dark, adjusting the camera. Someone had printed it, circled his face in red ink, and written across the bottom in jagged capital letters, "Watch yourself." He didn't remove it. He called the police. When they arrived, he didn't speculate. He presented the photo, pointed out the SUV's retreat, and handed over the footage. The officers said they'd include it in the active case file, and one of them, a veteran sergeant with a lined face and a steady voice, told him quietly, "This isn't neighborhood mischief anymore. This is stalking. Keep your door locked. We'll patrol more often." Martin nodded. He appreciated the words, but he also understood that a patrol was only a presence. It wouldn't stop anything, not unless it happened to be there at the exact right moment, and these people, whoever they were, had become very good at avoiding exact moments. The following morning, he found himself standing outside the city council building, waiting for a scheduled review hearing he'd been summoned to attend regarding external property hazards. The room was half full when he entered. Karen was already there, seated near the front, immaculate as ever in her sharply cut blazer and pearl earrings, legs crossed like she was waiting for a manicure. She didn't look at him, but her smile deepened the second she heard him step in. The hearing wasn't dramatic. It was worse. Passive, slow, suffocating in its formality. A panel of 5 council members read from printed packets, asked vague procedural questions, and maintained expressions of detached professionalism. Martin answered their questions directly, cited municipal codes by number, and laid out a timeline of complaints with supporting documents. When Karen spoke, she did so with a voice like honey steeped in venom. She talked about community cohesion, about safety concerns for our children, and how certain residents feel increasingly uncomfortable near properties that display hostile fixtures. She never mentioned Martin by name. She didn't need to. Everyone in the room knew, but she overplayed her hand. When the chair asked her to produce documentation of her claims, photos, reports, statements, she handed over a folder containing printed screenshots from neighborhood message boards, anonymous posts about strange behavior, and a blurred photo of Martin's security camera. The moment the council began flipping through them, one member frowned and asked, "Who submitted these?" Karen hesitated. "They were given to me by concerned neighbors." "Are these signed? Do we have statements?" "No, but—" "Then we can't enter them as evidence. They're hearsay." For the first time, Karen's composure wavered, just slightly. Her fingers tightened on the armrest, jaw stiffening. Martin didn't smile, but he felt it. That faint shift, the first crack in the polished wall. The hearing concluded without a ruling. They told Martin he'd be informed by mail. But the tone had changed. He could feel it. Not victory, but resistance. Bureaucratic immunity had its limits. That night, as he closed the blinds and turned off the porch light, Martin received one more message. This time, it was a voicemail. No words, just the sound of tires spinning in gravel. And then, faintly, a voice in the background. Not Karen's, but someone else. Male. Laughing. He didn't forward it, he saved it. Filed it. Not because he was afraid, because this time, when they came for him again, he wouldn't just have evidence. He would have consequences waiting. 3 weeks passed without incident. No messages, no letters, no movement on the driveway sensor in the middle of the night. The silence should have brought relief, but it felt brittle, like a surface stretched too tight. Martin kept his routines. He checked the mailbox every morning with a steady glance down both sides of the street. He reviewed the camera footage nightly, not because he expected anything, but because habit had replaced comfort. The hearing board's letter arrived on a Thursday. It was brief. 1 paragraph, 8 lines. The council found no basis for the safety complaints and ruled that his property met all municipal code requirements. They thanked him for his measured cooperation and encouraged him to reach out should he experience any further escalations. Martin folded the letter carefully, placed it in his binder, and returned to the garage. He didn't celebrate. He didn't even feel resolved, because there hadn't been a confrontation, no conclusion, no reckoning, just paperwork. That Saturday, while walking his usual loop around the block just before sunset, he saw Karen in her front yard pulling dead leaves from a hedge. She didn't look up, didn't speak. She wasn't dressed in her usual clean lines and bright whites. Her hair was unstyled, her eyes shadowed. Her SUV was gone from the driveway, and her porch plants sat dry, unwatered. Martin kept walking. Later that night, Julia knocked on his door. She stood on the porch with her dog leash in one hand and something folded in the other. "She's not talking to anyone," she said, voice low. "You heard about the firm, right?" Martin shook his head. "Legal trouble. That firm she used? The one that sent the fake cease and desists? Turns out they weren't licensed. City started investigating after someone filed a fraud complaint. I think that someone was your attorney." Martin didn't confirm or deny it. Julia handed him the paper she was holding. It was one of those anonymous flyers that sometimes showed up around neighborhoods. Unofficial, off-kilter, unprofessional. This one had a grainy photo of Karen at a neighborhood barbecue, smiling. Above it, the headline read, "Concerned or controlling, when watchdogs become wolves." The flyer had been printed on cheap paper and folded badly. No signature, just a quiet little ghost sent into circulation. Martin stared at it for a long moment, then folded it again and handed it back. "I don't need it," he said. Julia nodded and left. In the days that followed, Martin noticed more changes. Two of the neighbors who had once avoided his eyes now waved cautiously. The couple across the street trimmed their hedges at the same time he was working on his fence and offered him leftover coffee from their thermos. The air was still tight, the way it always is when a neighborhood has lived through something it doesn't want to talk about. But it was different now. The pressure had shifted, not disappeared, just moved. On the last Sunday of the month, Martin finished his repairs, packed away his tools, and stood in the driveway looking at the mailbox. It hadn't moved. Not bent, not scratched, not touched. A monument to every quiet line he had drawn. It wasn't about steel or cement or principles anymore. It was about weight, persistence, refusal to be moved. As he turned to head inside, something caught his eye. Sitting just beneath the edge of the hedge, partially tucked under the leaves, was the original mailbox shell, the vintage one, the one that had been taken at the very start. It was dusty, chipped, and worn, but intact, cleanly placed. No note, no message, just returned. Martin crouched, lifted it gently, and held it in both hands for a moment. He didn't look around. He didn't try to guess who had left it. He brought it into the garage, wiped it down, and placed it on a shelf above his workbench. He never mentioned it to anyone. But the next morning, when the sun was rising and the neighborhood was still quiet, Martin stepped outside, walked to the curb, and placed a small brass plate on the side of his steel mailbox. It read simply, "Still standing." And with that, the story ended, not with a shout or an arrest or a final confrontation, but with something heavier: endurance.